Hey everyone, welcome to the Brain Body Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Zimmerman. Beyond the diagnosis and symptoms, there's a path to feeling better. Dive into the world of brain-body connection and learn how to optimize your health. In this podcast, episode 6, I'm once again joined by Dr. Michael Lewis for the second half of a two-part series on the role of fish oils and their role in concussion recovery. In this episode, we dive way more into fish oils and what you should know about them. Whereas in episode 4, we set the stage by discussing concussions and what you should know. Enjoy.
Now I want to start talking about fish oils. Now, one of the first brain health research studies in nutrition was looking at suicide in active duty military that you were involved with. Can you tell me about that?
So as I was asking the original question, as anybody look at this, I knew I had to find out who knew anything about it. I had to educate myself. And there weren't, like I said, only the neurosurgeon in West Virginia, Julian Bales, who is now up in Chicago. But, some people might remember him. Alec Baldwin played him in the movie Concussion. He and I were the only ones really looking at omega-3s and specifically in brain injury, and still not a whole lot of people to this day are. But so I had to look elsewhere. I had to find out who knows things about omega-3s in the brain in particular. So I got to know a psychiatrist at the NIH. He and I became really good friends, and I was just learning as fast as I could from him. He had been doing 20 years of nutrition and particularly omega-3s in psychiatric diseases. And so, it's the brain, right? So I can learn from him. And at one point we were out, and I think he asked me, if we could draw blood on people before they commit suicide, we could probably answer a lot of questions. I'm like, why didn't you tell me that before? That's easy. And he looked at me like I was crazy. How do you know who's going to commit suicide? It's like the U.S. military, DOD, every time they draw blood on somebody, what's left over, they basically put it in a freezer in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and it's got all of DOD's data behind it. So I think now there's something like 75 million specimens sitting in a freezer. And they've been doing this since around 1992 or so. And so, we put together a research study. We looked at 100 well-documented suicides, 100 suicides a year for 8 years after 9/11, because we wanted to look, is there a component to wartime service with this, and 800 well-matched controls. And what I didn't realize, and I found out later, was we had 800 suicides, well-documented suicides, and I come to find out in that same time period there were like 3,200 suicides of active duty military during that same time period. So, but what that allowed us to, I think actually made the study even more valid, is all the blood work had been drawn on those suicides within 6 months before they committed suicide. And so, lipids, fats are really stable in the blood. So we felt very confident about that. And of course, we had tons of matched controls to be able to choose from. And so what we found was a 62% increased risk of suicide in those soldiers, sailors, and Marines who had a DHA, omega-3 level of 2% or lower. So low let me put that in English. So low omega-3 levels in the blood correlated to a 62% increased risk of suicide. Something that we could change literally for pennies a day with supplementation. And in fact, I said we had the DOD's data behind it, right? So we were able to look at who had been deployed, who had been seen for psychiatric reasons or mental health, sought mental health care. And none of those factors were anywhere near as important as literally just what were their omega-3 levels in the blood.
And that was the total omega-3s, not just like, well, EPA versus DHA. It was just a combined total omega-3 level.
Well, omega-3 levels, I mean, all these were significant. So omega-3 levels, but what we really focused in on was DHA levels, but omega-3 levels as well. And interestingly enough, the average omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was 26-1, out of balance. Omega-6s and omega-3s are meant to be in balance. That's how nature designed us. And we, as a society, a reflection of society, we were at 26-1 out of balance of omegas, too many omega-6s to the amount of omega-3s that we have in our blood.
Yeah, so let's break this down a little bit, because a lot of people are like, okay, what is this test, right? Like, can I get the test? Can my kid get the test? So I know there's different versions of this test out there, but, what's one of the ones that you like for measuring omega levels and then even breaking down the ratios and kind of the distribution for the types of omega-3?
Right. Well, the most tests that have been done, so typically, it's a finger prick type of test. Drop a couple drops on filter paper and send it in. There's a couple companies around the U.S. that do this. My favorite actually is out of Oslo, Norway. They've done over, I think now probably about 1.6, 1.7 million blood spot tests for omega-3s. A company called Zinzino, Zinzino, and their balance test. And it's that finger prick drop, on the filter paper, stick it in the mail, and you get results in 2-3 weeks. And what it's looking at is a number of different omegas and of different fats in the blood. And the two most important numbers are your omega-6 to 3 ratio, which is actually your EPA, your arachidonic acid omega-6 to the amount of EPA omega-3 ratio. So let's just keep it, as omega-6 to 3 ratio. That's the most important number most people have no clue about. Most people know what their cholesterol is, right? Some people are going to know what their vitamin D levels are, which is really, really important in this whole talk as well. But most people have no clue what their omega-6 to 3 ratio is. And like I said, in the military suicide study, 1,600 patients, we had a ratio 26-1. The second number that you can really get out of this is your omega-3 index. It's the total percentage of your omega-3s, your EPA, your DHA, your ALA, all these combined. What's percentage of all the fats, the fatty acids in the blood? So you should have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 3-1 or better. 3-1, 2-1, even 1-1, which is how we were designed. So that's the most important number, and easily the second most important number, or maybe just as important, is that omega-3 index. It should be 8% or higher. So unfortunately, when we, like I said, with the suicide study, we weren't looking at 8% or anywhere near it. It was the total omega-3 index was around 3.5%. And why is that important? Well, obviously for brain health, because that's what we're talking about, but also your cardiovascular risk. When you're at 3-1 or better, or 8% or higher, your cardiovascular risk goes down by almost 50%. And so it's something that we always talk about cholesterol, but nobody's talking about these omega-3s and, your risk factors. It's probably more important than knowing your cholesterol.
Yeah, it's important when we talk about these numbers as well, as I do one called Omega Check, and the lab reference range you've got to kind of ignore it. Whenever we're looking at a total omega-3 level of greater than 8%, most labs are like 5.5 or above. They're like giving you 2 thumbs up, gold stars. And really on the omega-6 to 3 ratio, most of them are just like, they kind of almost consider anything normal. They're not looking at a 3 to 1, a 2 to 1. And that's the other thing, So for those that are going to ask a provider to get this test, like, actually look at your values. Don't be like, oh, well, they told me it was normal, because what the lab considers normal and what's truly best for health are 2 different things.
Well, and, we could pick on anything. Let's pick on testosterone in men for a second, just because it's a pretty straightforward way to explain it. And, there's some tests I say you got to look in a horizontal way, like TSH for thyroid, where, it's from 0.4 to 4.5. Well, that's a huge log scale range, where on that horizontal scale, you want to kind of be more in the middle, like around 2, right? So you want a much more narrow range. It's optimal, not just quote unquote normal. But let's, in the testosterone, I look at it more in the vertical way scale. And so, different labs, different values, but it's generally around a total testosterone of 300 at the low end to 1100 or 1200 at the high end. And that's not a range. It's a 3 or 4-fold difference. And, so and people want to call it a normal range, but it's not a normal range. It's the reference range. And so what's the definition? It's over the last 10,000 tests that were done by that lab, it's the mean plus or minus 2 standard deviations. That's all it is. There's nothing normal. So if you've seen studies, decade after decade after decade, the average testosterone level in a 40-year-old male, let's just say, has come down decade after decade after. It's gotten lower and lower and lower. So that reference range continues to change, but has nothing to do with optimal.
Correct. And I'm going to have you define that one more time.
What's that?
I said, I'm going to have you define that one more time, because I really want people to hear that again, because people get so stuck on a lab range. But define once again, walk through how they come up with the reference range, because we need people to really see this from what the range is versus what kind of is reality.
Well, it's not just that. It's really, I would argue, it's what's the quote unquote normal range or the reference range compared to what is optimal. Mm-hmm. And, I want to explain it in terms of that most people can understand. If you're in high school and you're taking the SATs, do you want to be in the 5th percentile or the 95th percentile? Right? You may get into Harvard or Yale or Stanford if you're in the 95th percentile, but they're not even going to think about you if you're in the 5th percentile. So, optimal, maybe you can understand it in percentiles like that, right? So we typically want people to be, and depend on what we're measuring, but something like testosterone, we typically want to be 75th to 95th percentile. That's optimal, where you're going to feel good and where you should be. You take a 45, 50-year-old man and they've got a testosterone of 302 and the doctor looks at it and doesn't see an L by it, saying it's low, and says, oh, you're normal. Well, okay, but is it optimal is the question you should be asking. So again, it's determined by the lab over like the last 10,000 tests. You're looking at the mean plus or minus 2 standard deviations. So it's completely a statistical thing. It has nothing to do with, are you normal? Are you optimal? Are you anything other than, do you fall within 2 standard deviations?
Yep. So ultimately, there's a lot of sick people who are in there. They're skewing the values. It's just like a test score, right? You've got lots of people who don't do well. They're changing what the median number is. They're changing what the average is. And it's, we could talk about this with so many labs, but, with us focusing on omega-3s, we've talked about kind of the ratios of 3, the 6-to-3 ratio, suicide. But what do omega-3s even do in the brain? Like why do we take them, specifically DHA? Like what's it doing?
If you're finding this information valuable, please share this podcast with others and give us a 5-star review, as that is the only way this podcast grows. Please continue listening and keep enjoying.
Well, and some people, I give a lot of talks around the world, and sometimes the sophisticated audiences will like, well, why do you even bother with EPA when we're talking about the brain? Like, how do you discount EPA and only focus on DHA? And for, so the quick backstory on that, right, is omega-3s, they're carbon, so ALA is 18 carbons in length, EPA is 20 carbons in length, and DHA 22 carbons in length. And why we call it omega-3s is from the end, the first double bond is 3 carbons in from the end. So if you were to take one of those high school chemistry balls and sticks and make a DHA molecule with the double bond, what you would see is it's a very flexible molecule. Whereas an omega-6, the 20 carbon arachidonic acid, which is the main one found in the brain, it's got that omega-6. So the first double bond is 6 carbons in. It's a very stiff molecule. And you would see that if you had a model. So it's very stiff. So let's look at red blood cells for a half a second. So just red blood cells floating around. You got EPA and DHA. You got arachidonic acid in there. And if you have way more arachidonic acid, you've got stiff molecules in the membrane of the red blood cell. Well, the red blood cell's you think about it going through the smallest of capillaries, and that red blood cell's got to squish through in those small capillaries. Well, if it's a stiff membrane, it's not going to do that very well. So it's just not going to happen. Whereas if you've got flexible molecules in the membrane, that's going to happen a lot easier. So, that's just a structural component of it, and that's also correlates to a stiff membrane is not going to allow the inflow and the outflow of the different types of things, whether it's calcium and potassium or toxins in and out of the membrane. You need a flexible membrane, and it helps allow essentially like the cell to breathe. And, obviously no more important than in the brain. DHA is what's found typically in the membranes, whereas EPA is more of the downstream important in heart health. But the downstream effect from EPA helps relax blood vessels so that the blood can flow easier through there, whereas DHA is more in the membrane of cells, most concentrated in the retina, and second in the brain. And the downstream effect, there's constantly, this constant turnover. And as the omega-6s and the omega-3s are released from the membrane, the downstream effects have 2 different things. Omega-6s are pro-inflammatory, and omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, those downstream effects. And also the downstream effects of DHA, they've got things called resolvins and protectins. So the names kind of tell you what they do, right? And so that's really important in inflammation. So you got the pro-inflammatory and you got the resolving, it's a little misnomer to call it anti-inflammatory. It's more resolving, but we'll just keep it simple and call it the anti-inflammatory, meant to be in balance, right? That 1-to-1 ratio. But when we're 26-to-1 pro-inflammatory to the anti-inflammatory, it's no longer a fair fight. The other place where it really has an effect in the blood cells arena, again, is the omega-6 downstream effects are pro-clotting, whereas omega-3s are pro not clotting, right? Anti-clotting. And so it's meant to be in balance. So your blood needs to be able to clot, right? You have a damage to a blood vessel, you cut yourself, you want your blood to clot. But if your blood clots too easily, that causes things like heart attacks and strokes, right? So obviously we want a good balance between pro and anti-clotting as well as pro and anti-inflammation. And I'll just kind of bigger picture thing. Muhammad Ali, right? Took a bunch of hits to the head as a young man, died of Parkinson's much later in life, but, it was sad to see, how he aged. Was there a connection? I think most people would argue, yes. The question is, what's that connection? I would argue that connection is inflammation, and that the inflammation never quite gets resolved. And that's where we are with our food supply, where we're not providing the things to help resolve the inflammation. That's where we start talking about CTE with football players and others. It's this chronic inflammation that we continue to be exposed to that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the inflammation as well. That's the biggest thing. And that's where some of this imaging in the future looks pretty intriguing, because they can actually detect the inflammation that's still persisting. And, there's even research that was done, University of Montana or Montana State. They looked at football players that were doing a blend of fish oil supplements before the season and throughout, and they saw less brain damage with subconcussive blows compared to those who didn't take any fish oils. They were looking at a marker called
Texas TCU. TCU, Texas Christian University, 2014 football season.
Okay, they did this one there too.
Well, that was the one that kind of started this whole process.
Okay.
Jonathan Oliver was the lead researcher. I was an advisor on that. And what they did was they started June 1st through the end of the football season, and they had everything from zero, placebo, and different levels of omega-3s, principally DHA. And what they found was that neurofilament light, a marker of inflammation, was decreased or blunted, is a better way to put it, with the omega-3 levels with the players that were taking omega-3s versus the ones that were taking a placebo. And so, while it wasn't enough to show that it decreased concussions, they actually had half the number of concussions that they historically would during a year. But the numbers weren't big enough to be able to report that. They were able to show that the neurofilament light was blunted with omega-3 levels.
Which is massive, because neurofilament light, which, we don't have time to go into it, but it's ultimately a marker of damage. And so that's super important. And so when we're talking about preventing concussions as well as helping people recover, one of the first things we talked about is there's just not a lot of talk about nutrition. So we know the omega-6s are bad. What are some of the foods that people are eating that, you're just like, look, parents, coaches, trainers, please just have your athletes stay away from it's driving a lot of inflammation.
Well, omega-6s aren't inherently bad. They, we just consume too much of them.
Correct.
And so so they become bad just because of the abundance of it. And so you need omega-6s to make a brain and keep a brain healthy. But again, it goes back to balance, and you need that to be balanced with the omega-3s. So pre-industrial revolution, that ratio was really pretty close, or around 1-to-1. And we're talking about, people that live nowhere near the ocean, didn't have access to seafood, and yet the ratios were still pretty good. Reason why? Because you're eating wild game and natural things from nature, and everything from in today's world, you think of, say, hunting wild deer type of thing, or free range chickens might be or grass fed beef. Once the Industrial Revolution came along, then that ratio started to change. But then it really accelerated in the late 60s, early 70s with the Farm Bill. and how can we grow more calorically dense foods industrially? And the food that fit that the most was soybean. And so that rate, the amount of soybean consumed in the United States went up 16 to 20%, or not percent, 16 to 20 fold, like 16,000%. And you're like, well, but I don't eat soybean. Well, you think you don't, but you do. It's in everything. It's everything from the bottle of salad dressing. If you look, one of the first ingredients, soybean oil. But it's also what's fed to, soy and corn are the principal animal feeds in the country. And it's what's fed to the cattle and to the chicken, to the pigs and so on. So we consume huge amounts of soybean, whether you know it or not. And partly because the omega-6s are not only a stiff molecule, but they're shelf stable, right? So you could put a box of crackers out into the sun for 3 days, might be a little stale, but you could still eat them. You put a piece of fish, which is high in omega-3s, you can put it in the sun for an hour and you may not want to eat it, right? Because the omega-3s are unstable and they spoil quickly. So what do we do? If we want to process foods and ship it around the world, you're going to process them with omega-6s because they're stable. So the processed foods are what's really had an impact on our omega-6 to 3 ratio. So we've gone from 1-to-1 to 5-to-1 to 25-to-1 over the last, since World War II, really. And so it's really about that ratio. What we need to do is we need to get back to eating more wild game. But so principally, the biggest and best source of omega-3s to offset those omega-6s is fresh caught seafood. Basically, salmon is about the most perfect food. The wild caught salmon is about as good as you can get, which nowadays we can ship it around the world and you can get access to it. And like I said, 50 years ago, you couldn't get access to fresh salmon. So it was, how did that change? It's important. So good wild caught seafood is our biggest source of omega-3s, but also leafy green vegetables, the spinaches and the dark green vegetables. We just got to get back to, and you probably do this in your own practice, right? What am I really describing here? A Mediterranean diet. Right. So if you want a word or two for somebody, like, geez, I don't remember what he said, just remember this: Mediterranean diet. And that will tell you everything you need to know. It's the only diet, if you will, and it's not really a diet, it's a way of eating. It's the only diet that's ever been shown to actually be good for cognition. It's the only one that's ever been scientifically studied and shown. And so you think about what a Mediterranean diet is. It's eating closer to nature. It's, lean proteins, more seafood, fruits, nuts, vegetables, what nature provides us, not what man has processed and puts in your fast food bag when you go through the drive-through.
Yep, absolutely. It's getting rid of a lot of the processed foods, going more, like you said, healthy, fresh fish, wild caught. And not everyone's going to get everything they need from the fish, or else their numbers are so skewed because of what they've been exposed to. And I know you've been around the fish oil industry for a long time. And people see all sorts of different stuff in the grocery stores. They see it on Amazon because fish oils, they're being talked about a lot more in general. And people are going and they're spending all sorts of money on it. But what should people know about what they're doing? What should they even be looking for so they can make sure they're getting what they hope they're actually getting?
Well, unfortunately, you get what you pay for, is the old adage, right? And so if you think you're getting a good deal because you're going to a big store and getting a gallon of fish oil for $5, you're probably not getting a high quality fish oil. I would argue in some ways any fish oil is better than none, but better and more fish oil is, omegas are better than some. is one way to look at it. So you're right. I've been around the industry a long time. I know a lot about the manufacturing, and it's a couple of things. So I'll say you go to your local drugstore and you get the generic brand of fish oil. It's 1,000 milligram capsule, and it has 180 milligrams. And this is the only important part. How much EPA and how much DHA are in that capsule? And so you got 1,000 milligram capsule, and you have 180 milligrams of EPA and 120 milligrams of DHA. Add them up. What do you get? You got 300 milligrams of EPA and DHA, or 100. We'll just call it omega-3s in general. So you got 300 milligrams of omega-3s, but it's 1,000 milligram capsule. What's the other 700 milligrams? Oh, I don't know, because they don't tell you. Right? So you don't know what you're getting in that. And, knowing a bit about the process, let me dispel one other myth. There's as close, I'm not going to say zero, but there's as close to 0% chance of getting bad things in a fish oil as in terms of mercury, PCBs, heavy metals. Every fish oil in the market goes through a cleaning process to clean those things out. 100% of the fish oils go through that process. It's not 100% exact, but so it's as close to zero as you can get of risk of getting. So if you hear, don't take fish oil capsules because you'll get too much mercury, I call BS. It doesn't exist. It's not an issue. But it's quality. So the best products, if we're just talking about a capsule, the best products out there are going to be, so if you think about 300 milligrams in 1,000 milligram capsule, it's a 30% concentration is one way to look at it. The best products available in the market are actually in triglyceride form, which is you squeeze a fish, that's what you get, and 90% concentration. Well, if you're going to talk about what does it take to get a 90% concentration in a triglyceride form, that takes some serious manufacturing know-how. So it's going to be more expensive. But the quality that you're going to get is exceptional and far better than your cheap generic brand that you get at your local pharmacy or drugstore. So, I could go way into it far more if we had more time, but I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah,
you get what you pay for.
Correct. You get what you pay for, and don't get so distracted by the front label where they say you get 1.5 grams or 1 gram. Know what's on the back, as you've talked about, because you may not.
You have to learn to read the labels. Yeah.
What you're hoping, and
I mentioned triglyceride form, and let me just say a couple of words really quick about that. Triglyceride form. You squeeze a fish, you get mostly triglyceride form, and that's really important. The manufacturing process, when you're going through that cleaning process, they break apart that triglyceride and they have to combine it with something like sodium needs chloride, to stay stable, your acid and the base, so they combine it with an alcohol molecule. And that's called an ethyl ester now. And they're able to more easily separate out the good from the bad and get rid of the mercury and all that. But what the cheap ones do is they just put that in a capsule and sell it. It costs like nothing to make. And so you've got this ethyl ester. So if you're looking at a label in a bottle and it does not tell you it is specifically in triglyceride form, it's an ethyl ester form, without a doubt. And, there's no exceptions to that I know of. And why do I bring this up? Because you eat fish and it's triglyceride form, our body knows how to digest it. We have the enzymes to digest triglycerides. It's just part of natural food. And so we can easily digest triglycerides. But our body, ethyl esters are a new thing. It's only been around about 2 or 3 decades. Our bodies don't know how to digest ethyl esters. And so you're wasting your money anyway, because so little of it actually gets through the intestine into our bloodstream because our bodies don't know how to digest the ethyl esters. So you're wasting your money anyway. Spend a little bit more money, get a good triglyceride form, and get one that's concentrated and even better for you.
Yep. Absolutely. Great information, and then with your book, When Brains Collide, where can people get that from if they want to?
So I'm going to hold this up. I know I've got sort of that green screen, so I'm going to hold it up over my face for a half a second so people can see it. Hopefully that comes through.
Right there.
Okay.
Yep.
So you got an idea what it looks like. When Brains Collide is available principally on Amazon. It's a just-in-time print. So you order one, they hit the print button, and off it goes. So you can find When Brains Collide on Amazon, and it's actually been out for 8 years now and continues to sell month after month because hopefully, people say, well, you should update it. I'm like, there's really not much to update because the message is still the same. So When Brains Collide, available on Amazon.
Yeah, and then last thing I wanted to ask you, and have you share with people is you've got a nonprofit, the Brain Health Education and Research Institute. Tell people about that really quick. What's it about? Who's it for? And where can they learn about that?
So when I retired from the military 13 years ago now, I started Brain Health Education Research Institute, education and research. So I, used it to be able to try to influence research, but also as a forum to be able to educate people. And so brainhealtheducation.org or Brain Health Education on Facebook or Brain Health Ed on Twitter/X. Information out there. I'm constantly putting out educational information. Every day I get feeds on what's the latest news in brain trauma and omega-3s. And so I put out interesting articles all the time principally through the Facebook. I used to send out a newsletter all the time. I'm starting to get back into that. But over the last few years, there's been more and more of a need and people asking me for it. So we basically have started to, in addition to education, we're doing a little bit more direct care, principally of veterans, but we're looking to expand beyond veterans into, there's so many concussions. There's millions of concussions a year. So there's a big need for help, for not just for the information, but what do I do? And so we're transitioning into a more of a service organization, if you will. And so our service side, think of Brain Health Education Research Institute. Think of the initials BHERI.org or Berry.org. BHERI.org is more of our service side of things, in addition to the Brain Health Education.org education side of things.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. This has been awesome, talking about concussions, omegas, and just so much more to help parents and loved ones of those who've, had people in their family who've suffered a concussion, or even individuals themselves who've had concussions and are trying to help, in that acute phase, but also long-term, keep their brain in the best spot possible. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. I would say, when brains collide, just in case you're timid about, thinking about getting it, the audience, the book is written for the soccer moms out there, really. So I say moms can change the world, and that's who I really wrote the book for. So, think of it in those terms. It's not a textbook. It's written for the moms out there just trying to make a difference in their family.
Awesome. Thank you.
If you have found the material valuable, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dr. Spencer Zimmerman, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or where you normally listen to podcasts from. If you would like to work with me, visit peakbrainandbody.com to learn more. You can find me on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok, all with the handle Dr. Spencer Zimmerman. I'm also on X with the handle Dr. S. Zimmerman 5. This podcast is for general information purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other healthcare professional services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials are to be used at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not meant to be a substitution for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition that they have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.